Well, we've been dealing with Tamar and Judah and that the harlot by the side of the road story, and there are even though this is just a little story dropped in there, and often because of the nature of the story, it's not preached about very often, and kind of ignored, but the scholars. I think there's all kinds of very important and interesting things that need to be lifted up out of it. One of them is from Dana Fuel, who was one of our Barton Clinton Gordy presenters, and she had some interesting perspectives from the feminist side of the story. So much of the stories were told by, and then written down by, and then edited by, and redacted by, and so often interpreted by men. And so a female theologian and biblical scholar can give us a little different perspective. She says, there are instances, however, when the text cannot keep a determined woman down. Such is the case of Tamar, Judah's daughter-in-law, and despite the impulse to pass over her existence in silence in order to get on with the adventures of Jacob's favorite son Joseph, the story pauses. Seduced by scandal, Tamar refuses to stay hidden between the lines, and she creates a breach, pushing herself into the light, as her son is to do at the end of the story, but guaranteeing for herself a place, however marginal, in the family of Judah and in the memory of Israel. And then she goes on and kind of rehearses the story. Tamar, the young Canaanite woman, is Judah's hand-picked choice for his firstborn son. Now, that's something that, since it's right there in the first part of the story, we don't stop and look at that part. She was hand-picked. Judah, out of all the girls that were available, he liked Tamar and wanted her for his firstborn son's wife. So there must have been some very good qualities that he saw. But unfortunately, who is evil in God's sight, doesn't live very long. He dies. And then we have, and she puts it this way, enter Yahweh, a God of swift justice, the widow maker. Well, we do not know the nature of Er's evil, and we don't know if Tamar was the victim or the survivor of the evil. You know, that's something that isn't raised. It just says he died because he was evil. But we don't know what the evil was, so had she been a victim of whatever that evil was, or was he just out doing something on his own? We only know upon his death that she is left childless, and then that means without status in the society, and that's a critical point. And then Onan is given to her to do the Levirate marriage, to impregnate her and hopefully have a son that then could carry on Er's name and line and so forth. But out of his greed, because he doesn't want to split the inheritance, he's killed off by God again, or two also. And then Judah fears Tamar, thinks she's the cause, she's the black widow, and so he sends her back to her father's house, tries to get her out of the picture until Shelah, the younger son, can finally grow up. But that's a deception on Judah's part. and then Dana points out that he's unable to acknowledge any fault in his own male offspring. He wants to blame Tamar for their deaths. He thinks it's somehow her fault. And then he wants to keep her at a distance, so he sends her away to her own father's house. And to keep her marginal, a widow in her own father's house instead of staying within his house, where once she marries his son, she's a part of his family. And that's where she should have stayed. but he tries to get rid of her, sends her back to her father's house. But he doesn't release her from that obligation of being the betrothed spouse for the youngest son when he comes of age because of this Levirate custom. So he's playing games with her. And then time goes by and Sheila gets old enough, and Tamar is not brought back into the home to be Sheila's wife. So she takes off her widow's clothes and goes and dresses differently and at the gate of Enim. And Enim is literally the opening of the eyes. So that's not mentioned by other scholars. So that's supposed to have some significance in the story. She's at this place that's named the opening of the eyes. So something is going to be revealed here, supposedly, on this road to Timnah, or on the way to a reckoning. Now, this is an interesting way that she looks at this. Why does she change her clothes? Well, because Judah mistakes her for a prostitute. Interpreters usually assume that she has dressed as such, intending to solicit from him that very assumption. But, she says, another reading is possible. The veil she puts on is the same kind of veil that Rebekah wears when she first encounters Isaac. Now, she is already betrothed to Isaac because Abram's special servant, envoy, has gone off to acquire her and bring her back. And the deal has been made with the exchange of gifts that she would be Isaac's wife. But they haven't met yet. They haven't come together yet. And so at that first encounter, she is wearing a veil. And that is the veil of the bride or the betrothed. So that's a meaning for wearing a veil. And then Fuel asks, is it the veil of a bride that she is wearing there at the side of the road? Is it the veil of a woman betrothed? Is it the veil of a young woman available for marriage? Only mentioned here and in Genesis 24, it is clearly not an article of clothing associated with prostitution. And then she makes a parenthetical statement. Most likely prostitutes would have had their faces brazenly uncovered. I mean, it was if that's what you're doing, you're very immodest. You're not modest and veiled and private. You become very public. So she puts on clothes that signify a status other than widow, but as they do in restaurants. Anyway, a veil other than is or clothing that is not symbolizing or trying to symbolize being a prostitute, but she says but she is trying to get out of the garb of a widow that symbolizes I'm a widow, but she wants to symbolize or look different in some way. So she's redefining herself. And perhaps she hopes to confront Judah with his responsibility toward her. Maybe she wants him to recognize her for who she is, that she's not widow and to be abandoned, but betrothed to this son who's now grown up. Because, see, she wasn't running into him at her house or at the common house because she had been sent back to her father. Perhaps she hopes that when he sees her, he will be reminded that she is still betrothed to his family and that she should be married. That could be. And so if these are her real intentions, it is all the more ironic that Judah mistakes her for a prostitute. His failure to differentiate between a bride and a prostitute sparks for another pang of sympathy for his late wife. So Dana is saying he really is a jerk if he is so insensitive and unaware. Anyway, his failure to recognize his own daughter-in-law points to just how far she is from his mind. He sees what he wants to see. Again, sexy is in the eyes of the beholder, as I said last week, defining this woman in a way that is convenient to him. So once he starts the propositioning of her, and basically it's pretty straightforward. If we translate it, he sees her and he says, "Can I come in and have sex with you?" Basically is what he's saying. And then and we might imagine her irritation or anger rising, and with it, her determination to beat him at his own game. He wants a prostitute, so she gives him a prostitute, but a hard bargaining businesswoman who shows him to be the fool. She meets his needs, and unwittingly he meets hers by not only giving her his seed, but also giving her all the necessary articles with which to identify him as the father later. And so anyway, she goes on to make another point about Yahweh, about God, that after all, where is Yahweh in the middle of this story? When the woman must deal with the serpent, Yahweh is quick to punish the evil of and Onan, but he's slow to correct the injustice against Tamar. Instead, Tamar must work out her own salvation. Anyway, the main storyline of the male writers of the whole story are really trying to just show us and tell us that with all this kind of shenanigans going on, God is really in control, and God is guiding this history, and it's all going to work out in the end. And so these kind of things are all under God's control, regardless of how the story goes. But in order to keep you from going to sleep and not paying attention to the story, we're going to throw in some of these little exciting, little titillating stories to wake you up and grab your attention, so that then we can move on. Yeah. Oh, of the veil, and that I think it makes a lot of sense.
It does reinterpret.
Yeah.
It all plays by design.
Well, that's the way it's interpreted, and the way we have been conditioned to interpret it. But as I was saying last week, the changing of the word, the first, and I get to this a little later, but the first interpretation, the use of the prostitute is an onam, and it means common whore. But when he sends a servant back with the kid to find her and can't find her, then all of a sudden it's changed to the temple prostitute word, which is a whole different understanding. But then they can't find her, and he asks, "Did you see the temple prostitute at the side of the road?" Nobody saw any kind of prostitute when they go back. So the witnesses in the area did not see her as a prostitute. And if it was so blatant, then they would have all said, yeah, we saw her, but we don't know where she went. They just, no, there hasn't been one there. So again, in his, even the text gives evidence that Dana's interpretation has a lot of credence. Yeah. Yeah. Well, he's gullible. He thinks that he's in charge and there's no problem. He's a big shot. No big deal. He wants what he wants when he wants it, and sort of like Jacob and Esau. Esau was out hunting or working hard in the fields, and he's hungry, and Jacob has made this lentil soup, and so sure, I'll sell my birthright for a bowl of red stuff. What good is it to me if I die of hunger? So this example of one's physical needs or drives clouding one's judgment. So, he gives her all of those things. But actually the cord, the thing, it was what held the seal. It was kind of like official documents that are stamped with seals and that stuff you melt and wax. But it was like clay, and so they would roll it, and it identified, who was sending this document. And so the staff was also very unique and different, and since he was a big shot, that was probably had some jewels in it and was very special. But when they couldn't find her, they realized, well, just let her keep the stuff. We don't want to shame ourselves and embarrass ourselves by making a big deal out of it. So anyway, so they kind of let it go. But again, yeah. So it does challenge that, but I do think there's a lot of credence in it, because in all kinds of ways he's not honorable. He's not fulfilling his responsibilities, and in another way, he's not honorable by other perspectives. He left the clan, he went off on his own, and he's intermarrying with the Canaanites, which is not, in other times, and particularly when this is written, it's a great blasphemy. And then anyway, I'm going to deal with some of that a little later when I get to Kirsch's book, The Harlot Beside the Road. But Jonathan Sacks the rabbi, has some interesting perspectives as he draws upon the Mishnah and the Jewish rabbi's interpretation and dealing with this text for a long time. Let's see. He says that now 3 months later, the people begin to notice that Tamar is pregnant, and since Shelah has been kept away from her, it can only mean that she has slept with someone else and is thus guilty of adultery, a capital crime. Judah orders, bring her out so that she may be burnt. Now, usually adultery is by stoning, but if a daughter of a priest takes up prostitution, her punishment is supposed to be burning. So we've got, anyway, in the tradition, some different examples. But that's what Judah is demanding. And then only then does the full subtlety of Tamar's strategy become apparent. As she is being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, "The father of my child is the man to whom these things belong," she said. "See if you recognize whose they are, this seal, the pattern of the cord, and the staff." And Judah identified them and said, "She is more righteous than I am, because I did not give her to my son Shelah." Now, with great ingenuity and boldness, Tamar has broken through the bind in which Judah had placed her. She has fulfilled her duty to her dead husband. She has demonstrated a strong loyalty to keep his name alive. Otherwise, his name would be lost. And his own father didn't care enough about his deceased son to ensure that. So again, Judah is a jerk. Anyway, by sending him the coded message, the pledge, she has ensured that he will know that he himself is the father of the child, but that no one else will know this. To do this, she took enormous risk of being put to death for adultery, because if she and he are the only ones that know, he may not want to recognize it. He may still want to eliminate her, because she and he are the only ones that know that he is the father of a child by incest. And it would be convenient to have, this big public execution and do it quick and get it over with, and then nobody knows. So for her sake and for everybody's sake, he did have a come to Jesus moment. Anyway, her behavior became a model. So now Sachs is dealing with how did the tradition use this story. Her behavior became a model. It says, not surprisingly, the rabbis inferred from her conduct a strong moral rule. Quote, it is better that a person throw himself into a fiery furnace rather than shame his neighbor in public. It is better that a person throw himself into a fiery furnace rather than shame his neighbor in public. This acute sensitivity to humiliation displayed by Tamar permeates through rabbinic thought. And he gives some more quotes from Abava Metzia. Whoever shames his neighbor in public is as if he shed his blood. And then from another place, one who publicly humiliates another forfeits his place in the world to come. So that's an unforgivable sin, as it were. You don't get to go to heaven or get to be in the coming kingdom. Anyway, Rabbi Tanum taught, know whom you shame. If you shame your neighbor, you shame God himself, for it is written, in the image of God he made man. When Rabbi Elazar ben Azarah was about to die, his disciples sat before him and asked, our teacher, teach us one fundamental thing. And he replied, my children, what can I teach you? Let every one of you go and be very careful of the dignity of others. Do not shame others in public. And then he goes on to say, Judaism is a religion of words. God created the natural world with his word. God said, let there be. And this is the way the creation goes. And that's one reason why Judaism is so strong an ethic of speech. The other reason surely is its concern to protect human dignity. And then psychological injury, and this is drawing upon modern understandings, psychological injury may be no less harmful, often more so than physical injury. Some physical injury can heal and you forget all about it, but the psychological and humiliation sometimes leave deep wounds that may never heal. Anyway, hence the rule, never humiliate, never put to shame, never take refuge in the excuse that they were only words, that no physical harm has been done. We have that little saying that's trying to counteract that. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never harm me. Is that the way it goes, that little childhood thing? We wouldn't have that little thing if words didn't hurt so badly. So, anyway. And then he goes on to say, it says something about Torah and Jewish spirituality that we learned this law from Tamar, a woman at the very edge of Israelite society who risked her life rather than put her father-in-law to shame. Psychological pain is as serious as physical pain. The loss of dignity is a kind of loss of life sometimes for some people. It is, and it's because of great shame some people will commit suicide. They just cannot bear that pain. It is perhaps no coincidence that it was this episode, Judah and Tamar, that began a family tree from which 10 generations David, Israel's greatest king, was born. Now y'all remember that. And then Tamar, a childless widow, unable to remarry, was a person without position or power. And what it is that gave her this unusual insight into the fact of psychological pain can be as serious as physical pain. That loss of dignity is a kind of loss of life, and that may be what she experienced when her husbands die and then she's banished back to her father's home to become a nothing, to be lost in the shadows of the tents, as it were. It says something about the nature of Jewish spirituality that the Torah attributes this moral greatness to her and not to a direct member of the covenant family, to one of Jacob's sons. And the rabbi took her deed as a binding precedent for all of us. She took that sense of shame and used it to sensitize herself and avoid the shame of others. And then it's interesting, not only as the mother who produced a son who became the ancestor of King David and Solomon and the expected Messiah, then this great moral principle is attributed to her. Now, if because of all the sex in the story, if we don't deal with her, we don't learn those things. So now you all are in a special, unique group of people who know the truth. Now, he goes on to, and this is another reflection on this story. This is just 4 pages here, and I think it's another interesting connection. He says, Tamar, whose story is told in Genesis 38, bears an uncanny resemblance to another figure in the Tanakh. Anybody know who that other figure might be? It's Ruth, the story of Ruth, daughter-in-law of Naomi, eponymous heroine of one of the gentlest and loveliest books of the Hebrew Bible. And there are resemblances here. Both stories begin with a descent, literal or metaphysical, a journey from Jewish into Gentile territory. In Genesis 38, Judah went down from his brothers to live among the Canaanites. In the book of Ruth, Elimelech takes his wife and his sons to live in Moab. In both cases, there is an out marriage. Judah marries a Canaanite woman. Elimelech's sons marry Moabite women. In both stories, 2 sons die. Judah's eldest, and Onan. And in Elimelech's children, Mahlon and Chilion, both die. And in both, the central figures, Tamar and Ruth, are left as childless widows. Lots of common threads there. The prospect of widowhood plays a central part in each of their stories, though differently. Tamar is condemned to it because she can only marry Judah's remaining son Shelah, and Judah withholds him. And then, and the opposite is the case of Ruth, precisely because her mother-in-law Naomi finds herself a childless widow. She urges her daughters-in-law not to suffer the same fate and wants to send them back to their homes, but free them from the bond of her family and let them find husbands within their own community and not have to be childless widows from then on. And so Tamar is involuntarily a widow, but Ruth is voluntarily one because she stays with Naomi. And the prospect of her marrying and having children doesn't seem to be on the radar screen at that point. But when they go back to Bethlehem, then things change. Anyway, she stays within the tribal family and society. But both are still outsiders in another sense. Ruth was a Moabitess, and the Moabites were long-standing enemies of Israel. And as for Tamar, as we noted, she was a descendant from Shem, son of Noah. Yet the absence of any genealogy doesn't make that real strong. But Judah had left his brothers, and he married a Canaanite woman, and it says that his wife was a stranger, and then Tamar is also a stranger and not connected to the covenant family at all. So they were really big-time outsiders. But both women are driven by a specific kind of loyalty. The loyalty that motivates the biblical law of Yibbum, Yibbbum, the Levirate marriage. The Torah says that a childless widow who marries her brother-in-law and then has a child, the first son that she bears shall be accounted to the dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. And that's found in Deuteronomy 25:6, if you want to make a note of where that is. The book of Ruth explains in the context in her marriage to Boaz that the name of the deceased shall not disappear from among his kinsmen, Ruth 4:10. In both cases, they keep faith with their dead husbands in seeking to have a child that will bear his name. And each two exhibits loyalty to their in-laws. Ruth in refusing to leave Naomi, and Tamar in ensuring she will not put her father-in-law to public shame. So there's still two real strong character values here in both. The critical point of the narrative of each engages in some daring behavior. Tamar disguises herself as a prostitute, so we'll go with that traditional interpretation. And Ruth awaits. Well, of course, Jonathan is a male, and he's going with a lot of the tradition. I don't think he's read a whole lot of Christian feminist theology and biblical studies. But anyway, so he goes with that traditional interpretation. But Ruth waits until Boaz is asleep, and then from Ruth 3, Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man, and he turned and discovered a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," he said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer." Naomi had suggested a different approach. She told Ruth to uncover Boaz's feet. He will then tell you what you are to do. And Naomi assumed that it was for Boaz to take the initiative. Instead of saying, "Spread the corner of your garment over me," Ruth was initiating the proposal, telling Boaz it was his duty to marry her. And then we've got a quote from Ezekiel where God says to the people, "I spread the corner of my garment over you and covered your nakedness. I gave you my solemn oath and entered into a covenant with you, and you became mine." All the language of a marriage. The gesture as a proposal of marriage. In both cases, Tamar and Ruth boldly force the pace of the events. Now, there's something here that we don't usually understand unless we look at some biblical scholars that will tell us. It seems weird, but the mentioning of feet often or sometimes is a euphemism for genitals. And so this whole scene, we think, well, they're just laying down there on the ground, and she uncovers his feet. But we're talking about sex and procreation. And so uncovering his feet, and then in this quote from Ezekiel, taking the corner of his garment and covering her, but in this one, and covered your nakedness. So, anyway, if you're going to give third graders Bibles and ask them to read the Bible, you don't want all these kind of things too explicitly described. So we have a lot of euphemism that blows over the heads of the kids, but the adults can understand the symbolism and what's really being talked about. But with our distance from it, we don't sometimes recognize that. Anyway, in both stories, an extended form of Levirate marriage is involved. The man who becomes the father of the child or the children, Judah and Boaz in this case, is not the closest in line. For Tamar was Shelah who was supposed to be the one who would father a child, Judah's third son, and for Ruth it was an anonymous Peloni Almoni, and he says most of the time in Hebrew they want to translate it Mr. So-and-so or Mr. What's-his-name because nobody really knew who he was and he was no big character, and besides he didn't want to take on the responsibility and he declined. But finally, in both cases, the men pay tribute to the exemplary virtues of the women. Judah says to Tamar, "She has been more righteous than I." And Boaz says to Ruth, "I have been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother in your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." And then we have this blessing also that connects the two stories. When the elders give permission to Boaz to buy Naomi's field and marry Ruth, they pronounce this blessing from Ruth 4:11 and 12. "May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel," giving Jacob 12 sons. "And may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." So even the Bible connects the two stories. And then there follows the genealogy listing of 10 generations from Perez to King David. The beginning of David's family tree is the son Perez, born to Judah and Tamar, and in the 7th generation is the son Oved, born to Ruth and Boaz. So these are very important connections for the people of Israel and their King David. So the family tree holds these future kings, Tamar and Ruth, two women whose virtue and loyalty and kindness and discretion is surely contributing to David's greatness. But yet these two women were on the very margins of the society and the culture, and in a lot of ways were not acceptable. They were outsiders. So very interesting perspective there from the rabbi and from the female. You've had one. You've got a first question.
Another thing I see, they both had a heart of God to be a part of art.
Yeah. Yeah, their faithfulness and loyalty and willingness to accept the whole culture of their adoptive tribe or family would include their God, and were very faithful and embodying those very strong values of loyalty to the dead husband, because the Levirate marriage thing was pretty unique to the Israelites. It wasn't common among all those other tribes. So that sense of adopting this whole culture, but particularly the faith and the values that were a part of that faith. Yes, very, very, very good note to make. Yeah, Perez, yeah. Oh, yeah. Right. And again, this is another case whenever the traditional customs of the firstborn in inheriting the leadership role is subverted in some way, and a second son, or in Joseph's case down to Egypt, a much later son takes that position, then, according to the writers in our Bible and the tradition, it's just again saying God is in control. This is the will of God directing history. Because if the customs were in place, that second son wouldn't have had that that significant role in the story. He would have disappeared. And so, yeah, that's like our Jewish teachers at the Barton Clinton Gordy lectures will tell us when we see or hear something like that, like you saw that's, they're supposed to hear bong, this is important, pay attention. This has deep, significant meaning. We're weaving this thread through the story, and so we can see that God is guiding all of this. One of the things that Kirsch says in this Harlot by the Side of the Road, the forbidden tales of the Bible, that the others didn't, is that this Tamar and Judah story is right before we get back to Joseph, and Joseph, being the wife of Potiphar, is trying to seduce him. And he rejects her, and he remains righteous. I mean, that is going to follow right on the heels of this story of where Judah wasn't so righteous. And so that's an interesting point, and when we get there, we'll see if there's a whole lot that we can flesh out of that. But anyway, Judah is easily seduced, and so we have that. Then the backdrop of the whole story is the issue of the out marriages with the non-Israelites, and it reminds us again that if we remember Dinah and the rape of Dinah, and then the Shechem wanted to make it right and marry her. He loved her, and there was supposed to be this marriage and all that. And then Simeon and Levi go in and kill all the men because this is such a horrible thought that their sister would be married to a non-Israelite. It's a strong statement of not doing that. But the stories come from maybe 1,000, 1,200, 1,500 years earlier in the times of the patriarchs. They're remembering these stories, and they're passed on word of mouth. But the time they get written down is in the exile time and the post-exile, and so there is a strong sense of preserving our identity and who we are, and we can't be lost by intermarrying with people who aren't who we are. And so we've got, from different times in history and in different stories, it comes forward strongly, and then other times we have, like this one, it's no big deal. Judah goes away. He marries a Canaanite woman. He gets a Canaanite woman for his son. No big deal. It was acceptable at that time that it was happening, but the time the story are written, it isn't so acceptable. But again, they took the stories as they were. They didn't try to correct them by editing the story. They would just tell another story with the other perspective, and it would come down very hard. But anyway, Kirsch catalogs all of these out marriages for the lineage and history of the children of Israel, and he mentions that Joseph, when we get to him, he marries the daughter of an Egyptian high priest. So he's moving in big upper echelon circles, and he marries a high priest of the Egyptian religion. I mean, my goodness, how far can you stray? But anyway, but then Ruth is a Moabite woman, and Moses marries a Midianite woman, Zipporah, and we remember from the Moabites. Where did the Moabites come from? Well, the Moabites came from Lot's daughters after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and they're all told to go away, and Lot's wife looks back. She turned to a pillar of salt. So it's only Lot and his two daughters that survive, and because everybody got destroyed in the Holocaust of the conflagration of Sodom and Gomorrah, there aren't any men for the girls to marry, so they get their daddy drunk. They go in and lay with him. They conceive, and the older daughter, who remained unnamed, from this incestuous relationship with her father, has a son and names him Moab. and he is the ancestor of the Moabites, from Genesis 19. And the younger daughter had a son, named him Ben-Ammi, ancestor of the Ammonites. But Ruth is a Moabite. Ruth comes from that incestuous coupling. And then Ruth and Boaz have a son that then is in the lineage of King David and Solomon, and eventually, for Christians, Jesus. Tamar is a Canaanite woman who has a child by Judah, and his name is Perez. And so we have these two ancestors of David. And then David himself falls in love with Bathsheba, who was married to a Hittite soldier, and she was, doesn't say what she was, but probably not an Israelite, and probably is a Hittite herself. And then they have this son named Solomon, who becomes king. And then what does Solomon go off and do? He has a harem of over 700 wives, most of which are foreigners, with all these foreign alliances as he's trying to build the kingdom. And they bring their idols and their religion and so forth. But anyway, but then there's all these other places where intermarriage is so strongly condemned. Our scriptures are conflicted, and Kirsch points all of that out, and even reminds us that Hosea, the prophet Hosea, is commanded by God to go marry a prostitute as a prophetic demonstration of how far astray the people of Israel have gone and their unfaithfulness to God's ways. So, anyway, and then Kirsch goes and talks about this difference in the two kinds of prostitution that Tamar is labeled with. The Zonah is a common prostitute, and then the word for Kedeshah, which is the temple prostitute. And he raises a question of where might she have been working if she were a temple prostitute, or where did temple prostitutes hang out? It wasn't at the side of the road. It would be at a temple, and it could have been a temple of Ishtar, who was the Babylonian goddess of love, or Astarte, the Canaanite goddess of fertility, and that divine intercourse was understood as a form of prayer, and the prayer would be rewarded with abundant harvests and increase in the herds of cattle and flocks. Again, with kind of a male-dominated culture, sounds kind of convenient that such a system would develop. But Kirsch's research uncovered some recent archaeological sites of temples in the Near East which indicate that the Kedeshah might have actually been a midwife, a wet nurse, a singer, or maybe a sorceress, rather than actually a prostitute. However, all the activities may have been connected in some form with fertility and sexuality. For example, the result of sex is babies. Well, if babies are born, they didn't take mama to the hospital, they had midwives. And if mother had trouble producing milk, you had wet nurses to keep the babies going until they can get on solid food. But his conclusion from that is that it may have been that there was very little divine intercourse taking place, and not the wholesale debauchery that we hear in the diatribes from the prophets. But divine intercourse may have been very rare and only between a priest and a priestess. It may have been more like a pornographic display for people at the temple on a seasonal holiday or during bad times of plague or drought or famine. Anyway, so on the one hand, if changing this label for what kind of prostitution was involved with Tamar, some suggest that calling her a temple prostitute was trying to clean up the story. She wasn't just playing the role of a common prostitute, but that doesn't make a lot of sense, because if you're cleaning up her character, it's not a very kind thing to associate her with the pagan religion. And then if you're trying to clean up Judah's character, this is even a more outrageous sin, to be relating himself and going to worship in this way at a pagan temple or shrine, not being faithful to God. So